President Trump announced a new set of major global tariffs this week, 10% on all imported goods into the U.S., and he escalated trade wars with a second set of tariffs for about 60 countries.
In January 2024, the average effective U.S. tariff rate stood at 2.4%, the lowest since the end of World War II. By the spring of 2025, that number had climbed to 17.4%, the highest level since 1930, since the year the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act helped trigger the Great Depression. In a single calendar year, the United States imposed tariffs on $1.2 trillion in annual imports.
The extraordinary size and scale of the U.S. government and the business it does with companies should create value for American citizens.
Customs duties collected by the federal government surged 234%, from $79 billion to $264 billion. Nearly 90% of Fortune 500 companies flagged tariff risk in their SEC filings. The Federal Reserve froze interest rates to fight the inflationary blowback, and the World Trade Organization slashed its 2026 global merchandise trade growth forecast from 1.8% to 0.5%. This is not a story about one policy. This is a story about the fastest, broadest restructuring of global trade since the 1930s, executed through executive orders, emergency declarations, and a legal framework that the Supreme Court ultimately struck down, and most people never saw it coming. The escalation calendar. It started on January 20th, 2025, with a presidential memorandum called the America First Trade Policy. The document ordered sweeping investigations into trade deficits, currency manipulation, the $800 de minimis exemption, and permanent normal trade relations with China. Within 2 weeks, the first tariffs landed. February 1st, 25% on all imports from Mexico and Canada, 10% on energy products, and an additional 10% on China. February 10th, 25% on global steel and aluminum. February 27th, another 10% layered onto Chinese goods. By the time these took full effect on March 4th, 3 of America's largest trading partners were under simultaneous tariff pressure. Then came April 2nd, 2025, Liberation Day. Invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the administration declared a national emergency over trade deficits and imposed country-specific reciprocal tariffs on nearly every trading partner on Earth. The logic was mathematical: mirror the tariff rates that other countries charged the United States. The result was immediate. When reciprocal tariffs took effect on April 9th, the cumulative rate on Chinese goods hit 104%. 2 days later, it was 125%. The escalation continued through 2025. July 30th, 25% on India plus a 50% Section 232 tariff on copper, with the de minimis exemption suspended entirely. August 6th, India tariffs doubled to 50%. September 25th, targeted tariffs on pharmaceuticals, heavy trucks, kitchen cabinets, and bathroom vanities. Layer after layer after layer until the baseline tariff rate on U.S. imports reached levels not seen in nearly a century. The Supreme Court reset. On February 20th, 2026, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act did not authorize the levying of tariffs. The sweeping reciprocal and emergency border tariffs implemented throughout 2025 were functionally illegal. The federal government was ordered to refund revenues collected under those provisions. The administration pivoted within 48 hours. An executive order titled "Ending Certain Tariff Actions" was signed, and simultaneously, a presidential proclamation invoked Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, a Cold War-era provision designed to address fundamental international payments problems. The new order imposed a temporary 10% import surcharge on nearly all countries, covering approximately $1.2 trillion in annual imports. It took effect on February 24, 2026. By statute, it expires after 150 days unless Congress extends it. The tariff rate whiplash was extraordinary. The average effective rate had peaked at 17.4% under the IEEPA framework. After the Supreme Court ruling and the Section 122 pivot, it fell to an estimated 5.6% for 2026. But even at 5.6%, that is still more than double the 2024 baseline. And the permanent Section 232 tariffs on steel, aluminum, and copper remain fully intact. The retaliation cascade. The world did not absorb these tariffs quietly. By September 2025, retaliatory tariffs from foreign governments threatened or formally covered $223 billion in U.S. exports, more than double the $106 billion targeted during the 2018 to 2019 trade war. China struck first. February 10, 2025, a 15% tariff on U.S. coal and LNG, 10% on crude oil, farm equipment, and large vehicles. March 10, a second wave hitting 740 product categories. April 4th, tariffs elevated to 34%, combined with export restrictions on 6 heavy rare earth metals targeting U.S. defense and semiconductor supply chains. By April 11th, Chinese tariffs on American goods reached 125%. Canada moved in parallel. A $20.9 billion retaliatory package targeting steel, aluminum, and agriculture landed in March. Ontario briefly imposed a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to Michigan, Minnesota, and New York, before diplomatic pressure forced a suspension. The European Union readied a consolidated retaliation package worth €93 billion by July, though it paused implementation to negotiate. India went further. On August 8th, it formally suspended plans to purchase U.S. military arms in direct retaliation. The targets were strategic. Foreign governments aimed directly at politically sensitive U.S. export sectors: soybeans, corn, pork, LNG, crude oil, and coal. The agricultural heartland and the energy belt took the heaviest retaliatory fire. Who actually pays? There is a persistent political claim that tariffs are paid by foreign countries. The data says otherwise. Analysis from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, using detailed item-level import data through November 2025, found that U.S. firms and consumers bore nearly 90% of the economic burden. In the January through August period, 94% of the tariff cost fell on domestic importers. Foreign exporters largely refused to lower their prices. The household math is brutal. The Tax Foundation estimated the 2025 tariffs amounted to an average tax increase of $1,000 per household, with the Section 122 tariffs adding another $600 to $700 in 2026. The Yale Budget Lab modeled an even steeper impact. A short-run price level increase of 1.7% equivalent to $2,400 in lost purchasing power per household. Even after consumers adjusted buying habits, the sustained loss settled at $1,900. A Federal Reserve study tracking 200,000 households found Chinese imports experienced an 8.5% price increase by December 2025, with at least 30% tariff pass-through. Durable goods prices reversed from negative 2.2% to positive 2.1%. Leather products jumped 36%. Apparel rose 34%. The tariffs operated as the most regressive tax increase in modern American history. The GDP and trade deficit math. The stated goal of the tariff regime was to shrink the trade deficit and revitalize domestic industry. The macroeconomic data tells a more complicated story. The total U.S. trade deficit fell by only $2.1 billion in 2025, a rounding error on a multi-trillion-dollar trade relationship, and that marginal decline was driven entirely by services. The actual goods deficit increased by $25.5 billion year over year. The tariffs failed to alter the macroeconomic balance between domestic saving and investment, the fundamental driver of trade deficits that tariffs cannot reach. The Tax Foundation estimated that permanent Section 232 tariffs alone will reduce long-run U.S. GDP by 0.2% before accounting for foreign retaliation. Add retaliation, and the damage doubles. The Yale Budget Lab calculated that combined tariffs and foreign retaliation lowered real GDP growth by 0.5 percentage point across 2025 and 2026, leaving the long-run economy 0.4% smaller than baseline, equivalent to $125 billion in permanently lost annual output. U.S. export volumes are projected to remain 15% lower indefinitely. The revenue arithmetic is similarly misleading. While tariffs collected $264 billion in customs duties in 2025, the Tax Foundation estimated that the negative economic friction reduces the net dynamic revenue raised over the 2026 to 2035 decade from $662 billion to just $517 billion. A $145 billion gap between what the Treasury collects at the ports and what the broader economy loses in suppressed income and payroll taxes. supply chains, reshoring, and the freight spike. The tariff regime forced a geographic reconfiguration of global manufacturing at a scale not seen since the original wave of offshoring. China's share of U.S. imports dropped from 25% in 2017 to under 10% by late 2025. Vietnam, Mexico, India, and Taiwan absorbed the redirected volume, but friendshoring comes with a structural cost premium. Manufacturing labor in Mexico runs $28.34 per hour versus $6.80 in China. Reshoring showed real momentum. The reshoring initiative tracked 240,000 manufacturing jobs returned to the U.S. in 2025, with $3 trillion in investments announced. Newell Brands invested $2 billion to reshore Sharpie production to Tennessee, but gains were dwarfed by losses. Permanent tariffs cost 154,000 full-time equivalent jobs from Section 232 alone, rising to 329,000 with retaliation. The auto sector lost 98,000 jobs. Steel and aluminum downstream users lost 27,000. Heavy trucks shed 23,000. Ocean freight captured the volatility. The Drewry Container Index hit $2,279 per container by late March 2026. Trans-Pacific rates from Shanghai to New York reached $3,393, and the Containerized Freight Index registered a 37% monthly surge. Nearly 90% of Fortune 500 companies flagged tariff risk in their SEC filings. The sectors that bled. U.S. agriculture took the worst retaliatory hit. Agricultural exports, which closed 2024 at $174.1 billion, were forecast to drop to $169 billion in 2026, the lowest in 5 years. Soybean and sorghum exports to China collapsed. Net farm income was projected to fall to $153.4 billion, down $1.2 billion from 2025. The administration responded with a $12 billion Farmer Bridge Assistance bailout covering 19 commodities, from rice at $132.89 per acre to flax at $8.05. The tech sector navigated China's retaliatory rare earth export restrictions, while NVIDIA and AMD agreed to pay 15% of their Chinese AI chip revenues directly to the U.S. government to secure export permissions. Solar panel tariffs slowed renewable adoption and caused financial distress for installation firms. And small businesses reported the strain clearly. 59% cited lingering supply chain disruptions into early 2026, while 19% named taxes and tariffs as their single most important problem. In Puerto Rico, the tariff impacts were amplified by the century-old Jones Act, which prevents foreign vessels from shipping between U.S. ports and imposes an estimated $1.4 billion annual welfare burden on the island. By forcing reliance on costly U.S.-flagged vessels to import tariff-affected goods like solar panels and wind turbines, the legislation compounded the inflationary pressure, pushing the Puerto Rico Consumer Price Index to an all-time high of 139.81 in January 2026. From 2.4% to 17.4% in a single year. $264 billion in customs duties collected. $223 billion in U.S. exports hit by foreign retaliation. 90% of the tariff burden absorbed by American importers and consumers. A $1,000 to $2,400 annual tax increase per household. A goods trade deficit that actually grew by $25.5 billion. A global trade growth forecast slashed from 1.8% to 0.5%, and a Supreme Court ruling that struck down the legal basis for most of it. The Yale Budget Lab calculated the U.S. economy is now permanently 0.4% smaller, $125 billion in annual output that will never materialize. Export volumes are projected 15% below baseline indefinitely. The Section 122 surcharge expires in 150 days. And the Federal Reserve is holding rates at 3.5 to 3.75% to fight the inflationary aftershock. Between January 2025 and February 2026, the United States executed the fastest, broadest restructuring of international trade since Smoot-Hawley. It reshaped supply chains, collapsed China's import share from 25% to under 10%, triggered the largest retaliatory cascade in modern history, and produced a Supreme Court decision that invalidated the executive branch's primary tariff mechanism. The architecture of global trade was rewritten in 13 months. The question is whether the economy that emerges is stronger, weaker, or simply more expensive.